before I begin, I want to send a sincere thank you to Smitty and Time Sisters for this invitation to talk to you tonight. And as Smitty said, what I'm going to do is talk about some of the ongoing research that I have been involved in a pretty remarkable region of the world. And when we think about or hear the words Transylvania, a lot comes to mind, right? We think about remarkable landscapes, mountains, we think about castles, we think about this sort of idyllic place. We think about famous legends, right? It's hard to think about Transylvania without thinking about vampires and thinking about Bram Stoker's Dracula and films about vampires. We know, interestingly, that when Bram Stoker wrote the 1897 novel, he situated his protagonist at Bran Castle, which is a site that you can visit today in the region of Transylvania. What's interesting, and as you can imagine, because of this book, Bran Castle is a famous tourist attraction outside of the city of Brașov, which is in the country of Romania. But in real life, or historically, I should say, the real Dracula never went to Bran Castle, though there was the historical figure called Vlad the Impaler. He actually never went to Bran Castle. So it was Bram Stoker taking a little bit of license, but still makes for a good story and still is based on an actual person. And interestingly, as I'll talk about coming up, the region where my project and this project is based is only about an hour from the place where Vlad the Impaler was born. Now, before I talk about bioarchaeology specifically, I want to just give a little bit of geographic background to the complexities of the map and European geography. So the first thing to realize is that today, the region of Transylvania that we think of as Transylvania and that historically is Transylvania is in the modern day country of Romania. This is a fairly recent phenomenon, however, because this is a very new boundary, new in the sense that for centuries and centuries and centuries, the region of Transylvania was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. And what's interesting, when you look at the map, I'm going to try to annotate here and not mess up our slides. When you look at the map and you see the bottom right-hand image, you're going to see this curved area of topography. That's the Carpathian mountain chain. And for all of its history, the Carpathian mountain range in this region of Eastern Europe formed the eastern boundary of Transylvania. And so for most of its history, this region was connected to the Kingdom of Hungary, and later on, prior to World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When we look at the map that's on this slide in the upper right-hand corner, what I want you to see is this area that is here, that is green and orange and pink. That map in and of itself tells you some quite interesting things. First of all, it tells you that the region of Transylvania prior to World War I and for centuries and centuries and centuries prior to the outbreak of the war was a really interesting and multi-ethnic place. It's often been described as a melting pot, similar to where we describe New York City as a melting pot. And this means that in this particular region, there were people who identified in numerous cultural groups. So on the map, I'll circle it again. In the orange, we have Romanians. In the pink color, there are Transylvanian Saxons. And in the green, we have communities of people who are Hungarian. And for centuries, these people coexisted and lived in this region, all having kind of a Transylvanian identity. It's interesting that the identity of being Transylvanian for people historically was as important as being Saxon, as being Romanian, as being Hungarian. I also will note that there were communities of Roma who you might have heard of if you know about Europe. Maybe you've heard of people who are Romani, Roma, sometimes referred to as gypsies. They were in this region too. They didn't necessarily have a specific place where they settled geographically because of their nomadic tendencies, but they were there too. So as we think about this region, I want you to, in your mind's eye, recognize that the map that you're going to look at today, and that if you went to Transylvania today, you would be in Romania. But that is a very recent phenomenon, only since the conclusion of World War I, and really the conclusion of World War II, because there was a period of time during World War II that northern Transylvania, actually because of Hungary's relationship with the Third Reich, part of northern Transylvania actually went back to Hungary during World War II. And there are people who are alive today whose citizenship changed. So if you were born during World War II, you were Hungarian, and then your citizenship changed back to being Romanian. In fact, if you were born in, say, 1938, you would have been born in Romania, then you would have gone back to being Hungarian, then you would have gone back to being Romanian at the conclusion of the war. That is not lost on people today, and it would be fair to say that even today in this region, there are still people that have some tension between Hungarians in this region and Romanians. In part, as we'll see, the Hungarian communities have stayed fairly constant, and people wish, in a sense, that they weren't Romanian citizens. And in fact, today, people who live in this part of Romania can also get Hungarian citizenship too. They're considered part of the greater Hungarian state, or the Hungarian diaspora. I'm going to show another figure on the next slide, and we'll get a sense of what this boundary looked like in approximately the year 1600, which is one of the years, or certainly covers the time period where my colleagues and I have been studying. So just to reiterate here, here's Hungary. This is prior to the combination of Austria and Hungary to form the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This is the Kingdom of Hungary by itself, and the red X, where I'm going to draw, is the region of Transylvania. So this is where we're going to focus, and this is a place that has a very rich archaeological history. In fact, I'll go so far as to say a spectacular archaeological history, in that there are numerous villages that are part of the UNESCO World Heritage Area that are broadly called the villages with fortified churches in Transylvania. And I believe there are 7 of them that are on the UNESCO World Heritage list today. And the great thing about the UNESCO World Heritage list is that many of those sites have been preserved, that they've incorporated tourism, and I should say sustainable tourism, into the presentation and preservation of some of these sites. And for instance, the buildings and the architecture are just spectacular. So one of those 7 sites is a complex called Biertan. And you can see the fortified church. Obviously, it's easy to see the church in the middle and the fortifications and then the surrounding villages on the outside edges. And so if you were to go to the region of Transylvania today, much of why tourists go are to see some of these UNESCO sites and to understand this history. What's quite interesting about the history of many of these fortified church sites that are on the UNESCO list is that they were villages of Transylvanian Saxons. So that even if you go to Romania today, of course, you're going to see the Romanian flag, you're going to hear the Romanian language, you're going to see Romanian names. But if you go to these fortified churches, at least 6 of them are Saxon, which means the names are in German. And when you see their World War I and their World War II memorials, you'll see names that are German. One of the fortified churches is Hungarian, and so you'll see Hungarian signage, Hungarian names there. But many of these are indeed Saxon. And it's certainly true that Saxon folks and Hungarian folks and Romanians interacted, but they did sort of silo themselves off. And there's been a lot written about the interactions and then the segregation to some degree as well. So it's a complex history. Interestingly, from the perspective of history, there are fewer documents than historians would like, in part due to the tumultuous nature of this region in the more recent centuries. For example, Transylvania was also incorporated into the Ottoman Empire during the height of Ottoman expansion. There are many accounts of villages being razed by advancing Ottoman armies. There are accounts of just losses and fires, so on and so forth. We all can remember the cathedral at Notre Dame a couple of years ago with the roof fire. Well, we know that those kinds of things occurred in the past and in the historical past. And so part of those architectural losses meant that documents were lost. So in many instances, while there are some surviving documents, the archaeological record is the best way that we can understand about the people in the past. And so what I want to do now is talk a little bit about bioarchaeology and how bioarchaeology, the study of people themselves, is something that gives us tremendous insight into the communities of this particular region. Now, I also want to preface that in the remaining slides, I do have some pictures of human skeletal remains, and these skeletal remains have been given to me with permission, or that I'm able to use them with permission, particularly of the descendant communities that are part of this region. So I'm using these images with permission, and is something that is quite important to just recognize that the skeletons that you're going to see from these excavations are used with permission. A little bit about bioarchaeology in general. The field is relatively recent in that for US archaeologists, we look at the year 1977 as an important date. And that's because in that year, a professor by the name of Dr. Jane Bijkstra coined or used the word for the first time in an archaeological publication. People were doing bioarchaeology prior to 1977, but 77 established the field as we understand it today. And what we know that in some parts of the world, they use the phrase osteo, which sounds like osteoporosis or bone. So the field of osteoarchaeology in many instances is synonymous with the word bioarchaeology. So if you see that word osteoarchaeology, it means the same thing as bioarchaeology. And ultimately, what we do in bioarchaeology is that we emphasize the human biological component of the archaeological record, or the fancy way of saying that is we use skeletons from archaeological sites to reconstruct places and time periods in the past. And of course, bioarchaeology is interesting because it uses multiple lines of evidence to make these sorts of interpretations. So we obviously use the archaeological context, excavations, maps. We use written documents if we have them. We use the biology from the skeleton, what we know about people from their skeletal remains, to answer particular questions. And we also use bodies of social theory that archaeologists and other social scientists have used to examine things about mobility, identity, the environment, economy, so on and so forth. And those three pieces of information form what we refer to as the bioarchaeological model. And so bioarchaeology is important because it really brings a comprehensive look to the communities that we're interested in. And I should say that though this presentation focuses on bioarchaeology in a particular place, Transylvania, at a particular time, the medieval period, I have colleagues doing bioarchaeology all over the world and from many different time periods as well. So if you are interested in the question of what does the skeleton tell us, or what kinds of knowledge does bioarchaeological scholarship produce, we really do a lot. And I have a colleague who's a professor at the University of Notre Dame, Dr. Sue Sheridan, who uses an acronym, or a phrase I should say, where she talks about the 6 Ds, D as in demography, of bioarchaeological research. And so what do bioarchaeologists study? We study things about populations demography, the age and the sex distributions of communities, who was buried and why. We study things about people's diets, what people consumed, how they got their food, how they processed their food. We study diseases and how diseases affected people in the past. We're interested to know how long particular pathogens have co-evolved or affected human populations. Diseases like, for example, tuberculosis or leprosy, even plague. It's possible to find examples of plague, or even more recently, trench fever. So there are many different ways which couple the hard sciences with archaeological data to look at disease processes. We're interested in indicators of daily life and habitual activities, which means, for example, bioarchaeologists can use the skeleton and make inferences about behaviors over time. So, for example, if people engaged in a particular activity, let's say agriculture, right? If you're an agriculturalist or you're planting crops in a certain way and you're using your body over and over and over again in that way over your lifetime, you may have a different, say, appearance or anatomical cross-sectional property of your bones. So we can make inferences about daily life. We know, of course, that bioarchaeologists study how people participated in death rituals, and we use mortuary data to answer those kinds of questions as well. And lastly, we use bioarchaeological research to examine questions about something called biological distance, or genetic relationships between people in populations, or between people in multiple communities. So bioarchaeologists study many different kinds of questions, all of which have the end game of answering particular questions about people in the past. And on the next slide, I thought it would be useful for people to see examples of the kinds of works that bioarchaeologists produce on all kinds of topics. So these are book covers that focus on broad and differing topics, like the bioarchaeology at the transition to agriculture, or, for example, the bioarchaeology of children, or examples of human conflict and interpersonal violence, the bioarchaeology of violence. So the work that bioarchaeological scholars focus on is very distinct too. So there are folks who study really particular questions in the bioarchaeological record. But now, with that background about Transylvania and about bioarchaeology, I want to take the rest of the time this evening to talk about this project specifically. And we're going to focus on bioarchaeology in Transylvanian Hungary. So again, you're looking at a map of Eastern Europe, and you're looking at the faint yellow lines are the modern political boundaries. But what's important to see here is this green band, which focuses on the region of Transylvania. And then within that, we're going to focus even more narrowly here. So as I mentioned, for most of its history, Transylvania was part of Hungary. That means, of course, there were Hungarians in Hungary. And I, with my colleagues since 2013, have been working in a region of Eastern Transylvania, or now Central Romania, that is dominated by an ethnic group of Hungarians who refer to themselves as Székely. That's the S-Z-E-K-E-L-Y word that you see in the right side of your screen. And so if you were to zoom in on the modern map today, this is what you'd see. This region right in the middle of Romania is the region where this project is based. And myself, my colleagues from the United States, colleagues from Romania, and Hungarian colleagues in Romania have been studying for the last 8 years the communities of people who lived in this very picturesque Transylvanian region. This work would not be possible without my colleagues at the local museum in a city that has a couple of different names depending on whether you speak Hungarian or Romanian or both. And the name of that city is Odorhelyő or Székelyudvarhely, both of which are mouthfuls for English speakers. But it is this museum that has a division of archaeology that works in the community to perform archaeological excavations, mostly in small villages throughout this particular place. So with that in mind, what I now want to do is begin to talk to you about how bioarchaeologists use information from the skeleton and archaeological context to make inferences about the past. And what I want to focus on is that our unit of analysis, we can focus on entire populations, which I'm going to discuss momentarily, but we can also focus on individuals. And there's a lot that we can say about how individuals lived their lives in their household, in their village, and in their community at large. And so in order to sort of have an entree into that topic, I'm going to talk now about how bioarchaeologists use data from the skeleton on really particular kinds of topics. The first thing I want to talk about is the kind of observation that we make in instances where people have had cranial or skull injuries, but injuries that they have lived to tell the tale about, or that they've survived. And the technical phrase for what we call this is antemortem cranial trauma. It just means a head injury that did not kill you and that you survived. And we see evidence for this in the archaeological record. And we can tell by looking at bones if a person's bone healed up, or if shortly after the injury, for example, they might have passed away. What's interesting about these kinds of pieces of evidence, however, is the relationship, of course, of the bone and the soft tissue that it protects, which is obviously the brain. And so what we're starting to realize is that by seeing the evidence of cranial injuries in the past, we may start to be able to have evidence for traumatic brain injuries or TBI. And unfortunately, many of us in our lives maybe know people who have gotten traumatic brain injuries, and we know that traumatic brain injuries are not an event that you bounce back from instantly. In fact, you might actually suffer the consequences of a traumatic brain injury for the rest of your life. And this is a very obvious thing to people in the clinical sciences, but is only something that bioarchaeologists have started to recently think about. And by thinking about this question, it's opened up many new questions for how people fared in their communities, hundreds or thousands of years ago. Something that's quite interesting that bioarchaeologists have done, for example, is they have demonstrated that people in medieval Europe who sustained cranial trauma and survived their cranial trauma actually died earlier. A group of scholars that are in Denmark, as well as Penn State University here in the United States, have a long-term project focusing on medieval people in Denmark. And they have very sophisticated ways for doing demographic analyses of archaeological populations. And what they've found is that in medieval Denmark, people who had cranial trauma actually died earlier than people in the same community without cranial trauma. We see the same thing today when we look at vital statistics, epidemiological data, and public health data. So it's not a surprise, but it's one of the first times that this has been something that we have observed. Now, what's interesting in the United States, of course, is that we have historical figures of our own who we know sustained cranial trauma and had traumatic brain injuries for the rest of their lives. On this slide, you see a picture of Harriet Tubman, the American abolitionist who was a leader of the Underground Railroad. If you've seen the recent film Harriet, you've seen this, but you may not know that Harriet Tubman, because of an injury that she sustained as a teenager, she had narcolepsy throughout the rest of her life because of it. We know on the right-hand side of this screen, the railroad worker Phineas Gage suffered a traumatic brain injury during a workday. And after the injury, Phineas Gage's personality changed remarkably. And it was the first time that physicians and psychologists or early psychologists realized that brain injuries affect people's, or have the potential to affect people's personality. And so the bottom line is that we know that the consequences of cranial injuries have really significant consequences. And even though we can't see those in the soft tissues, and even though we don't have written records all the time, we may start to be able to use what we know about modern cases and make some inferences about people in the past. And this has recently been published on in a case from Neolithic Sweden, so several thousand years before the medieval period. But in this paper, colleagues reported on a case of an individual who had a skull injury, an antemortem cranial injury, and then they report on the kinds of clinical complications that a person who injured their skull in a particular anatomical location may have had. And importantly, they also talk about the kind of care that a person would have required had they had that kind of injury. So not only can we think about the impairments that people sustained, but we can also recognize that other humans in their household would have had to provide some kind of care, either in the short term, or likely even in the long term. So when we think about human behaviors and the human capacity for care, caregiving, etc., we know that it's not a new phenomenon. Otherwise, we would probably see no evidence of healing in these instances, and that people probably would have died very shortly after sustaining their injuries. So let's now take a look at how this relates to medieval Transylvanians. So here is a Google Earth map of the community where this project is based. And if you recall from a moment ago, the museum that I showed you is located in this town with the red X. And what you'll see on the periphery of the image are yellow dots. Each of those yellow dots represents a village where the archaeologists in this community have performed excavations related mostly to the preservation of very remarkable medieval village churches. The first of which you're going to see here. This remarkable building, this image is from a drone. This is a church that was originally built in the 12th century and has been changed over time with the centuries. This community experienced the Protestant Reformation. And for those that need a refresher, one of the things that happened is that after towns or communities became reformed, they covered up much of the iconography associated with the Catholic Church. In many of these buildings prior to the Reformation, there were beautiful murals on the inside and the outside of the church, which depicted stories from the Old and the New Testament. Well, interestingly, in the preservation of this particular church, they uncovered a mural that is from the 16th century. And you can go to this church today where people still worship and see that mural. And one of the other UNESCO World Heritage sites that I mentioned is also has a mural, and that mural dates from the year 1419. Really remarkable. So turning my attention back to this community, and the Hungarian word for this village is Bögöz. They really emphasize the O with the umlaut in Hungarian. Well, in this particular church, what they did as part of the preservation was to install a drainage system. And that drainage system required a trench that was built in the churchyard. And of course, when you excavate in a churchyard, you find human remains. And so that's what was uncovered. And in this particular excavation, 191 burials were recovered. And what I want to do is turn our attention now to the burial of a middle-aged adult male who, after we radiocarbon dated a small sample of bone, he lived sometime between the year 1450 to 1640. And why this relates to the question of antemortem cranial trauma is that when I took a close look at his cranium, I saw what should not be there. And when you look at this is on the left side of the skull, and it's on a bone that we call the parietal bone, you see this very clear opening. That opening is antemortem cranial trauma. You also see this line. That line is called a radiating fracture, much like I would see if I was examining a contemporary forensic case. If someone had a head injury, I see that radiating fracture. What's clear about this defect, or the hole, is that the edges of it are very smooth. And that means that this injury healed up, and it healed up for some period of time that's pretty significant. Now, if my next slide works, I want to show you a bit more about this cranium in detail and to highlight some of the efforts of my colleagues here at USF in the Access 3D lab. And I think you've had a talk by Dr. Laura Harrison already. So thanks in part to Dr. Harrison's technology and the fact that my colleagues in Romania allowed me to bring this cranium back to the United States, we were able to create a three-dimensional scan of the skull or of the cranium. And I'll play that for you one more time. And I want you to be able to understand how this kind of technology allows bioarchaeologists or any archaeologists to share three-dimensional data. I also want to pause for just a quick second and have you look at the posterior part of the cranium and this large hole. What's important for someone like me to be able to do is to differentiate what an injury like the hole on the side of the head is from the back part. This is what we expect to see when, what you're looking at now is what we expect to see when people are buried in coffins. This is something called coffin wear. And so we see it when you're laid in a coffin on your back, the parts of the skeleton that rub the floor of the coffin wear away over time. And so you can also, by looking at a cranium like this, even make an inference about how the body was treated after death if you see the presence of coffin wear, even if no wood or coffin hardware survives. So for example, if you were buried in a shroud, and only a shroud, I wouldn't expect to see coffin wear. So by seeing this, I'm pretty clear that this individual was also buried in a coffin. So what's cool about these three-dimensional scans is that they allow us to share information. And so I have a colleague and a friend who I've known since college who is now an assistant professor of neurology at the University of Kentucky College of Medicine. I was able to take this three-dimensional scan, email to my friend, as well as mail physically a 3D printed copy, because I was very interested in my friend who's an expert on traumatic brain injuries to help me interpret what might have happened to this man and the subsequent injuries that he acquired by this significant and severely invasive cranial injury. And so the part of the brain that this man would have injured was his parietal lobe. And so if you injure your parietal lobe, you sometimes lose the ability to retain short-term information. It's also possible that he lost his sense of taste, his sense of touch, or lost the ability to feel temperature on the right side of the face. Again, if you injure the left side of your brain, the right side of the body can be impacted. Then lastly, it is possible that he also lost some ability to comprehend speech. So the idea about putting all of this information together is that when we're trying to think about the life of this particular man, when we recreate what many bioarchaeologists refer to as the osteobiography, we should really start to think about the consequences of the traumatic brain injury and the recognition that this man would have almost certainly had to have relied on care of people in his community and in his household, and that as we think about the lives of people from the medieval period, that it gives us another way to think about how people interacted with each other. It's also something to say that when he passed away, he was afforded a burial in the churchyard of the community, that he was buried in a coffin, and that he wasn't placed in some other location. We do know that during this time period, that if people were somehow a socially marginalized person, an outcast, a person who had committed a crime, oftentimes those people were not afforded burials in the churchyard. And so the presence of his body in the churchyard says at least a minimum amount of recognition that he was still a member of the community. And so we can really hone in on the lives of individuals. But now what I want to do is think about another kind of community in this village altogether. And we're going to go about 20 kilometers away to another village, this time south of where the museum is located. And we're going to take a look at a very picturesque village called Telekfalva. When you imagine Hungarian Transylvania in your mind's eye, these kinds of picturesque villages nestled in the hills and valleys are what we think about. And in the middle of this community is the village church, which was and still is in use, except for a period of time in 2007, when after a period of very heavy rains, the inside of the church flooded. So in order to mitigate the flood, the church decided that they would need to remove the pews, remove the floor, and install a drainage system. But because of the reality of possible human burials, they called on my colleague to perform an excavation. And lo and behold, even though they weren't sure what they were going to find, they in fact did find human burials. This time, 70 burials were uncovered. And remarkably, these burials were mostly of very, very young children. In fact, of the 70 burials, there was only one adult. And of the 70, 49 of the individuals were preterm or full-term infants. So this is a remarkable context because we see that inside of this particular church is where people in the community were burying newborn babies. And what's interesting is that several of those babies were buried with coins in their right hands, as is not totally uncommon in Catholic and Protestant Christian traditions. And once the coins were conserved, we were able to, or my colleagues were able to read, I should say, dates all from the 17th century. And in this particular case, the coin has a date stamped of 1625. So we have really good evidence of a 17th century behavior of, in this village, children and young babies being buried inside this particular church. And very interestingly, in the community that I just described and several of the other villages, this is the only village where young babies are almost exclusively buried inside of the church. All of the other sites, very young children are in the churchyard mixed amongst adults. When we took a close look at these skeletons, we saw some interesting markers on the bones of physiological stress. Of course, if there are physiological disturbances that can come from things like nutritional deficiencies or infections, the body responds, and sometimes that response is left behind on the bones. And so the remarkable thing about these stress indicators, of course, in newborn babies, we're actually seeing a snapshot of some of the stresses that their mothers were under. And we're still puzzling over this question, but we do know, for example, that there could have been seasonal food shortages, that there were bouts of vitamin C deficiencies, and other kinds of indicators that said, or that suggest that even though these were hardy agriculturalists, that occasionally there were crop shortages, or there could have been times where they didn't have very broadly nutritionally rich diets. And so if women needed vitamin C, they might not have gotten vitamin C. So this is a new area of bioarchaeological research where people are beyond just examining the bones of very young babies. They're now starting to ask questions about the women who gave birth to those babies and the women and the families who made very specific and intentional choices to bury their children inside of churches in consecrated spaces. It's quite interesting, even though beliefs about baptism, about salvation changed between Protestant or between Catholic and Protestant communities, one of the things that's really clear is that parents were very concerned about the salvation of their children, period. They wanted their children baptized and they wanted their children buried in the church. And they didn't honestly care who did it. So for example, there are historical sources that talk about midwives doing the baptism. Even though the clergy might not have wanted it, mothers and fathers wanted their children baptized. And so we're thinking about the social context of infant burials as well. One other aspect of this project involving the young infants is that I have collaborated with geneticists at the University of Oklahoma who are really good at getting very old DNA out of bones. And you can do this with some very sophisticated methodologies that they know about to look at different genetic markers. One of those genetic markers are mitochondrial DNA markers called mtDNA haplotypes. And as just a very brief biology reminder, mitochondrial DNA is maternally inherited. So your mitochondrial DNA you got from your mother, she got it from her mother, who got it from her mother, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a way we can look at kinship, and we can look at contributors to mortuary communities by looking at mitochondrial haplotypes. And in this case, we saw of the 10 samples, we saw that 2 of the mitochondrial haplotypes were identical. The rest were different. And that means that these 2 burials, the word shear or sir is pronounced shear, that means burial, that burial 7 and burial 8, though they were buried separately, are either siblings buried at slightly different times or maternally related first cousins. So it gives us a sense to think about maybe the number of individual families that lived in this particular village. One of the other things that you're able to do with DNA is actually look at genetic sex. Babies are too young for a bioarchaeologist to look at their bones and know if they are a male or a female. Really, we can't do that until a person has gone through their growth spurt during puberty. But you can do this genetically. And what's interesting is that of those 10, we were able to get good DNA from 3 females and 5 males. Now that's not a lot so far, but what we do know is that in contemporary populations, even here in Florida, in the United States, that baby males have higher mortality rates than baby females. So I hypothesize that if we were to look at the DNA of all of those babies, we're going to see a bias towards male individuals because baby males have a higher likelihood of mortality. And this is useful because in other parts of the world, for example, during the Roman period, there have been instances where people think that there was sex-specific infanticide or that certain one sex was killed at birth. But of course, in this time period, we know that that was not the case. And I think that if we examine all of the data, we're going to see something that fits the trend that we see today. So, to conclude with the last example of how bioarchaeology tells us about the lives of medieval Hungarian Transylvanians, I want to take you to the current excavation, which is very close to the community that we just looked at. And this is a community called Patakfalva. And Patakfalva, just like every other village, had a village church that was used for hundreds and hundreds of years. But in the year 1802, there was an earthquake, and the church was damaged beyond repair. So people in the village razed the building, salvaged what building materials they could, and rebuilt the church in another part of the village. That meant that the architectural footprint of the medieval layers and the medieval churchyard and cemetery were lost. And in fact, a modern cemetery began to be built right on top of the ancient medieval layers. So my colleague, the same one who has been doing all these other excavations, decided that they wanted to preserve some of the medieval archaeology so that the modern cemetery, as new burials were put in, that the church would not be lost. So from 2014 through 2019, and hopefully whenever COVID is over and we go back to Romania, the excavation will continue. But you can see on this map, there's been quite an extensive excavation, and you can see the footprint of the building and the sheer number of burials which have been recovered. In fact, we've recovered 665 individuals from this context. So you can see here is the footprint of the church in its various construction phases, and even remnants of the wall of the church, which if we were to draw over here, or then continue to draw over here, is what we imagine the entire site to look like. So what we have, despite the hiatus of the pandemic, is an ongoing field season and excavation season and lab season that is an experience that students from the University of South Florida and other universities can participate in to gain experience in bioarchaeology and archaeological excavations. So students can come and work with our field crew directed by my colleague, who's a professor at Western Carolina University, on excavations. We also have what's called an ossuary that is going to be part of this project. I think I saw on the call a PhD, soon-to-be PhD candidate from the University of Tennessee, my alma mater, Armando Anzolini, is going to be directing that part of this project. And then students can gain excavation in the ossuary or with burials, or they can work with me in the laboratory analysis of these burials. And we anticipate that by the time the excavation is done, there will be somewhere between 800 to 900 individuals. So when we say that we are still in the midst of this project, it is a really true statement that there is much more to learn, even though we have learned a lot, and that we're finding out a lot about these medieval Hungarian Transylvanians. There's a lot more to know. What's very interesting, and I'll leave you with just a little bit of data that helps us reconstruct how people ate, the kinds of things that they ate over time. And maybe you're familiar with other presentations, something called stable isotope analysis. Stable isotope analysis gets at the adage, you are what you eat. And the long story short is that we can look at the kinds of proteins that people consumed. We can also look where people got their grains from. Well, these are data that were generated by me and my research assistant, Christina Trent, here at USF. And we were able to look at a couple of these pieces of information about people's dietary practices. This axis, the x-axis of this graph, shows us that people consumed mostly wheat cereal grains, wheat or barley cereal grains, since people cluster together kind of close together like this, except for one strange outlier who has actually got an anomalous radiocarbon date. What's a little more interesting is this axis, which is an axis showing nitrogen or protein consumption. And this shows a fairly far spread across the adults buried at this site. We know, for example, that this community had some kind of hierarchical organization, and lo and behold, two individuals that were recovered from a tomb which had the most elite members of the village, and we know that because we can see their name in the few historical documents we have. We can see their name stamped into some of the coffin material that is there, the Ferenczi family. And lo and behold, these two males who were buried inside of the church have isotopic evidence of having the most enriched protein in their diet, which means that they had the most access to the most amount of protein, as opposed to some of the individuals lower who maybe didn't have as much or didn't have access to the same kinds of proteins that these individuals here had. So in conclusion, we know that by this line of inquiry with isotopic analysis from this community, by looking at DNA from the other site and thinking about the small children, or thinking about isolated burials of individual people, that we can really say a lot about the lives of medieval Hungarian Transylvanians. And really, we see the importance of the bioarchaeological approach for understanding the past. So with that, I want to say again to Smitty, to Time Sifters, and to all of you, thank you very much for attending. And I also want to thank my colleagues here in the United States and abroad for all of their collaboration on this project, for which my work would not be possible without their help. And hopefully, when the pandemic is over, we'll be back doing this really cool project. So thank you very much for your attention.